and welcome to SagePoint Update. I'm Joyce Riggs. I'm here today with our special guest, Joe Bianculli. He's an attorney with Healthcare Lawyers, and Joe is here today to walk us through a very, very complicated process, regulatory process for nursing homes in the state of Maryland and federally, and in particular, this last year and a half because of COVID, how this has affected SagePoint. So Joe, thank you for coming. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
So first, can you give us an overview of how this case happened to come about on SagePoint?
Right. SagePoint really got caught up in the COVID pandemic. It got caught up in the regulatory environment. It got caught up in the politics. It just got caught up in everything. So it might be useful for the viewers for me to just give you a very, very brief overview of the nursing home regulatory process, which really kind of tells us how we got here. I mean, it's commonly said that nursing homes are the second most regulated business in the country after nuclear power plants. The problem is that there's just layer upon layer of regulation. There's federal regulation of various sorts, there's state regulation of various sorts, and there's other regulations. For our purposes, I want to talk to you a little bit about the inspection or survey process, what we call inspections, the government calls surveys. Right. I mean, as you can imagine, protection of the health and safety of vulnerable adults is a critical government function. And so over the years, this inspection or survey process has just grown and grown and grown and gotten more and more picky. Any facility like SagePoint that participates in the Medicare and Medicaid programs is subject to federal regulations with just add-ons and add-ons over the years. Big, thick book, hundreds and hundreds of topics that are regulated. And then the federal government enters into contracts with the state health departments, in the case of Maryland, the Maryland Health Department, to do the inspections. So you have already another layer there. You have the federal government trying to give instruction to the state governments on how to do surveys and what to survey. And as you can imagine, there sometimes is lost in the translation there. And as you're going to see in a few minutes, that's pretty much what happened here. Normally, the general or annual survey takes place roughly once a year, and they look at everything top to bottom. Then either the state or the federal government can do complaint surveys, all kinds of different surveys. And they're typically done by a nurse or a team of nurses coming in from the state health department to look at either a particular item or to look at everything from top to bottom. And that's what happened here. Once COVID started, and we'll talk about the background with Kirkland and so forth in a minute, but once it started, the federal government realized pretty quickly, within a matter of a few weeks, that there was a major problem. And so they quickly scrambled to put together new instructions to surveyors to look at what they thought was a major concern at the time, which was infection control in nursing facilities. But the listener should be aware that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has published over the years many, many infection control guidelines. The ones that govern nursing homes were published in 2007. Again, they're very comprehensive, but they are what is known as symptom-based. That is, they presume that a doctor or a nurse can recognize that a resident has or a patient has an infection by the way they present their symptoms. That, of course, turned out to be a major challenge with COVID because that wasn't true. All right, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. So right from the get-go, there was a disconnect between what the federal government asked the states to look for and what was going on at the nursing facilities. To sort of jump ahead in our story a little bit, when the state cited deficiencies or non-compliance at SagePoint, they had a hard time explaining exactly what it was they thought the facility had done wrong. So when the state imposed a civil money penalty, a fine, we appealed that. We challenged that before an administrative law judge, before the State Office of Hearings and Appeals, and we won because we were able to show that SagePoint didn't do anything wrong, but also that the allegations that the state had made of infection control violations and the like really didn't allege violations of any standard. So sort of wrapping this all together for the overview purposes. So the federal government, has all these regulations, but none of them really addressed COVID. None of them really anticipated that kind of a major clinical emergency erupting in nursing homes across the country all at once. So the surveyors, the inspectors, really didn't know how to approach it. They really had not been trained in how COVID was different from the typical types of infections that would break out in healthcare facilities. And so we wound up with just a big, a ball that kept going down the hill, picking up sticks and pebbles as it went, but really, there was really never any there. And we've seen this at other facilities in other surveys throughout the country. We'll talk about some of the details as we go through our discussion today, but that's sort of the background. I mean, there's a regulatory process that never really contemplated COVID, and so when the surveyors came into SagePoint, they really weren't able to evaluate what the facility had done and what was going on in the facility in terms of the traditional survey and enforcement process.
And it's a very complicated story, but you did a wonderful job in breaking it down for everyone. So thank you very much for coming, Joe. We appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us again, and we'll look forward to talking to you with our next update.